Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I look forward to being part of a vibrant discussion on the way forward as we all move out of lockdown. We have individuals on this session from a wide range of backgrounds, levels, and also locations, both in the UK and internationally. So hopefully this leads to a wide range of questions as we go through the session, and also perspectives. On the topic of questions, please do add these into the chat facility as we go through the session. This will allow Rob to really build in some good questions and answers towards the end. How this is going to work: we are recording this session, and we will be able to provide you with a copy of the session over the next week or so. There will be no personal information recorded anywhere within this video. Please do keep yourself on mute as we go through the session to avoid any background noise or feedback. And again, on the questions side, if you add these into the chat box facility, I will then add these and ask Rob towards the end, and again that will be anonymous. On to Rob. Of particular interest to me, and I sense the bulk of people on this session, are the perspectives that Rob has gained over his many years at Mercer, a firm that successfully introduced agile working, and also has worked with a wide range of firms where he's led on improving the gender balance across many organisations, and also successful work with the Chartered Management Institute. I will now pass you over to Rob.
Thanks, Tim. Could I just check, can everybody see me and hear me okay? Great, super, okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining this hopefully very timely webinar. I've actually been lured out of sabbatical by those lovely people at IPS to lead this webinar today on returning to work post-lockdown. I actually retired in January this year after a 42-year career at Mercer in the HR and talent arena. And after retiring, I spent 8 weeks in the US on sabbatical, returning to the UK in early March when this whole COVID-19 crisis was just getting accelerating, as it were. So I've lived through the lockdown with all of you, and I've seen the very real challenges that we've all been facing to our lives, our businesses and our communities. We're now at this stage that people are calling returning to work, and we're using this in the title of our event today. But the reality actually is that most of us have been very much at work over the last 8 weeks during lockdown. And actually, most of us will be continuing to work from home, at least for the time being. But the virus has changed everything about how we live our lives, both at work and at home. And while there's been a big impact politically and socio-economically, I want to focus today on the impact on our business and our working lives of the return to the workplace. And I want to present some material that I've put together. As Tim said, we'll send you these slides after the webinar. So, hopefully you won't need to take too many notes. But obviously, as Tim also says, please pass your questions through because we want to deal with those as well. So the UK was put into lockdown on the 23rd of March. I'm sure we all remember that famous TV broadcast by Boris Johnson. And initially it was 3 weeks, but then it was extended, and it's clear that lockdown is ongoing. Albeit slightly lifted and could last for some time yet. Who knows? Jenny Harris said it could last 6 months or more, the Chief Medical Officer. So I guess one of the questions is, we all had to react to this. How fast and how well did your business react? How did your business perform during this period? And how did your leaders lead? Did they thrive in this environment, or did some of them shrink? And how did your employees react? And so basically how we all were really facing this. A survey by Mercer, my old firm, showed that only 22% of companies were actually really ready for mass remote working prior to the outbreak of COVID-19. So that meant that many companies had to move really swiftly to get there. So the question, I guess, is,
Rob, you're muted, I think. Rob, just before we go on, we seem to have a couple of people who can't see the slides. I don't know if we want a quick show of hands of how many people that is. Seems to be 3 at the moment. Oh, they can now, I think.
Okay.
I can only see the slides. I can't see Rob.
Okay. I'll carry on, and we'll sort of. I think it's kind of just the way we'll have to do this particular webinar. So the question I was really asking here was how your lockdown was. Was it despair and anxiety as everything got turned upside down? We've been trying to juggle the kids, their homework, entertaining them, our jobs, our partners' jobs. We want to do the cleaning, the cooking, the childminding, and all the time we've also been worrying about our finances, our careers, and quite frankly, we're really fearful about the health and well-being of our friends and our loved ones. Obviously, we've been working from home. We've been living in our homes with all of the fun of Zoom video calls and Microsoft Teams and Google Hangouts. We've been thrust into flexible working with all of the issues of a home office, trying to find a quieter space to work, trying to find a comfortable chair, propping up our laptops on books, making sure we've got a good broadband connection, all of the things that to try and make this work. But just trying to move the slide on. Maybe your lockdown was like this, because actually there were really a lot of positives coming out of this as well. There were some interesting, really new developments as we saw colleagues, respond really sort of proactively to this. And we've seen a higher level of sharing, a higher level of intimacy with each of us as we develop relationships with work colleagues on a broader and maybe even deeper level than before. And as I mentioned, employees have been really innovative. And one of my former colleagues is a personal fitness buff, and he ran Zoom workouts for colleagues. So it was really interesting to see how employees were responding to the situation they were placed in. I think also we slowed down. We enjoyed being able to roll out of bed a bit later, I think, and then into the office with no commute. And we all seem to have had a bit more time to be present and really sort of notice the spring blossom, which I think is mostly gone now. So that's been our environment. And this really, remember this? Whoops, remember this? This is how we used to work. Sorry, slides moving slightly slowly. And I found this and I thought, my gosh, I felt really panicked when I saw this photograph, because it's people basically very close together. I almost wanted to shout out, "Oi, remember your social distancing," because this is kind of like how it used to be. But this actually is more like the new office reality as we're coming back. It's going to be much more about social distancing and frequent disinfecting and deep cleaning. So it's going to be a change for all of us. Now, how should companies be navigating the chaos that we've had caused by the coronavirus? This is a great slide taken from Cognizant, which is the digital solutions and consulting company. And they've been running a number of good events and producing good work on this. And I thought this slide was great in terms of how it sort of really describes well how businesses have been dealing with this crisis. So this whole thing about staying safe, firstly, caring for the team, really getting business continuity working, and getting HR and talent management activated, but then really realizing there's a new normal here that we've got to start thinking about. So what's the impact of that going to be, and what impact that's going to have on our supply chain? Can we virtualize work? Can we cost contain? And how do we invest in our customer and the customer experience? So what that led to really was the need to modernize, and very rapidly, basically to automate everything that we could automate, to apply tech, to raise productivity, and to really use the digital as tools at our disposal to really launch new customer experiences and new customer products. So that whole, modernizing using the digital tools at our capability, at our access to do that. And then really reimagining the industry. So are there non-intuitive partnerships that we could be going into, working with companies in different sectors, potentially, for example, around things like talent pooling? Could we share talent between organizations as we're all searching for more flexible models about how this might work? So that's kind of been the new reality. And as I say, companies have had to move quickly. One bank I'm aware of went from having 3,000 employees working remotely to 30,000 employees working remotely, very quickly. So it was a massive shift in mindset and attitude. And of course, now the genie is out of the bottle. They made remote working work and employees embraced it. So what do they do now about the 27,000 employees that became remote? Do they try and bring them back into the office? So these are some of the issues that we're trying to address and work through as the economy recovers. And of course, as we know, it's going to take time. Ernst & Young predicted it might take up to 3 years for the UK to fully recover back to where it was before. So this is no temporary phenomenon. We really need to be thinking about this new reality. Coronavirus, we know, is going to be with us for some while, and many of these changes to our business and our lives are going to be long-lasting and are even permanent. But actually, I believe that out of this chaos, there are also some significant business opportunities for those companies that can pivot, that can reinvent their business models and innovate new products and services. And I believe actually that human ingenuity and creativity will prevail. We'll work out a way to deal with this. We'll work out a way to do business better in the future. But not necessarily all companies will get there. Maybe not all leaders or employees will get there. We need to be thinking about how we can transform ourselves and the organizations we work for to survive into this new environment. But the chaos of COVID-19 has perhaps provided a catalyst for us to do that. So I mentioned that we had that broadcast originally from the Prime Minister about lockdown. There was another one on Sunday about working from home and the return to the workplace. And basically the message is still work from home if you can. And the steps that the government has been setting out, and they sent out 50 pages of supporting material, were all about helping organisations prepare for work and prepare for when the office reopens. So it's still clear that employees should be working from home and they shouldn't be forced into an unsafe workplace. So actually the majority of us will continue working from home for the time being, while employers work out how to create a safe return for us. But this is going to be very different, as I mentioned earlier, to the old office, and businesses are being asked by the government to carry out a COVID-19 risk assessment in consultation with trade unions and workers. And employers are going to have to publish those results and put them on their website. This is going to be, a very important step that employers have to take. And here's the kind of poster, or is the poster that companies will need to put up in their premises, which basically certify, if you like, that they've carried out the risk assessment, they've done the hand washing and the hygiene procedures, they've taken all reasonable steps to help people work from home and to maintain that 2-metre distance. And obviously to manage transition risks. So there's good guidance from the government on what that risk assessment needs to contain, and you can look at that and really work through it with your people to make sure that your workplace is secure. But there are broader issues here as well as just is the workplace being disinfected, is the workplace safe to work? There's also these changes I mentioned to how we need to work as businesses and these broader issues. So I want to really move on to those now, because I want to think about returning to work to help build, in the future, more sustainable, resilient businesses and workforces. So here's an interesting study that was done by TRN World, a global recruitment network. I'm sure many of you know. It was looking at what's the preferred blend of working from home or being in the office from the companies that they surveyed. And what you can see here is that the preferred blend was 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. At least that was the 33% of the sample chose that. And I think what's interesting about that is it does kind of indicate that the model that we'll have going forward will be one where we're not all in the office, and each company will have to work out what it thinks is right in terms of the balance between time in the office and time at home. Who actually needs to be in the office, what roles need to be in the office, how do they rotate people in and out. These are all these issues that businesses will need to work through. But in preparation for this, I've been talking to organisations about what their concerns are right now. And it's very clear that there are concerns around safety, of course. How do we ensure employees are safe when they return to the workplace, and staffing, what staffing levels are we going to need, and obviously what space are we going to need going forward. But there are these broader questions really about things like culture. How do we maintain and develop our culture when a lot of our staff are remote working, and that's going to be continuing? How do we engage and motivate staff that are working in the office and working remotely? How do we manage the performance of employees working remotely? And what support do we need to give our leaders and staff to ensure that they're working effectively? So it's these concerns that I wanted to address in what we were talking about and try and look at these in turn. And the three issues that I picked out of this really that I think companies need to go into address for the future are what they do about their culture and flexible working, because I think the culture does need to change towards a more agile culture, as we'll hear. What they're doing about mental health and well-being for their employees, because again, employees will have very strong concerns. I think the CIPD, for example, survey showed that 40% of workers were worried about going back into the workplace. Actually, I was surprised it was as low as that. But there are real mental health and well-being issues that employees are feeling and experiencing, and employers need to address that. And then leadership and management. How does leadership and management need to adjust, in this new environment? So, looking at the culture first, it won't be surprising to know that with all of the home working and the move online, that the culture of the future will need to be lean, agile, innovative, and digital. And so companies need to be kind of supporting that if they want to be successful. But I think that's the kind of the tech part of it. The people part of it is increasingly important too. The values base, in other words, putting people first, being inclusive, including all the talents, including everyone, in making everyone feel they belong and are empowered, and frankly, an element of trust, that actually the employers trust the employees to deliver on what they need to achieve through remote working, for example, and that they can also maybe be trusted to make more decisions and to be more proactive about things that need to change. I think also we'll see an increasing interest in the growth mindset, which is all about learning and skills development. So we're all going to need to adapt to an environment which is constantly changing. So the culture of our organisation needs to be one that's a learning culture, basically, where people can try things. Maybe it doesn't work out, and we learn from it and we move on. But that growth mindset, I think, is going to be increasingly important as we navigate the future. And of course, we need to keep that laser-like focus on customer needs, because the customers' needs are changing, and I'm sure you're talking regularly to your customers about what they're looking for and how working with them is changing. So that continued focus on responding to those needs and putting customers in the picture as well will be very important to succeed. I mentioned flexible working. That's been a bit of a concern for some people, because basically, if you can't see people in the office, are they really doing what they're supposed to be doing? And there's some real questions about how flexible working works for organizations. But actually, it isn't just about where the work gets done. It's actually who does the work, what kind of work gets worked flexibly, how it's done, and when it's done. So, that all those different elements of flexible working need to be thought through. And can everyone work flexibly? Do all roles lend themselves to flexing? Maybe there are some roles that don't. So organizations need to work out which of those are flexible and which of those maybe less flexibility. Now, of course, I mentioned flexible working is already happening. So how do you extend those current arrangements that you've got to meet the needs that we're all going to have of the future for remote working? And what guidance have you already given to employees? And perhaps do you need now to give, since this is going to be ongoing, on how to work effectively when they're working flexibly and maybe working remotely? Obviously, there's a question about the support you need to put in place. Communications, frequent communications, obviously, to remote teams, but also what equipment do they need to have? What are the working arrangements so that work can continue with a combination of people in the office and people working remotely? And of course, there'll be the need to optimize productivity and manage the performance from flexible working. So again, that might be new to a number of organizations, so how to really adjust and how to make sure that happens. And then, of course, how do you keep flexible workers engaged and keep them connected? So those are some of the key questions, really, that people are raising about flexible working. But actually, of course, there are real benefits. And I mentioned the Chartered Management Institute earlier. They did a survey which was looking at the benefits of flexible working. And quite surprisingly, 95% of the managers that they surveyed felt that their organisation supported a culture of flexible working. So that was encouraging. 80% felt that flexible working improved employee well-being, and 68% felt that it would actually improve employee retention. So there were some real benefits that people were seeing in flexible working, and it was a question of how to realise those. So one of the things that Tim mentioned at the beginning was that when I was working at Mercer, we were very successful in bringing through flexible working. So for us, when we transitioned into this new environment, we were able to do it at speed. But some of the success factors that were important in achieving flexible work at Mercer, and indeed in other organisations that I've worked with that have done this, are really listed here. And those are really around things like providing clear guidance to employees and really a kind of nudge to managers, basically, around all roles can flex. So basically what Mercer said was that, actually all roles can flex and you need a good reason why they can't flex. And that might not be the exact message you want to give in your organisation, but there's that kind of nudge that basically says, look, we're in a flexible working environment now, so let's all get with it. Obviously, there's the need then to establish the extent of flexibility for each role, as I mentioned earlier, but it's really about the tone from the top. The leaders need to support the policy and work flexibly themselves. And, this needs to fit with a culture, as I mentioned earlier, of agility and digital. So it's all part of supporting that. What we also found is that organisations, if they're going to make this work, need to trust their employees to deliver on their performance goals. Just because they're out of the office and potentially out of sight doesn't mean to say that they're not working harder. In fact, there's quite a bit of work been done and research been done that flexible working actually results in employees being more productive and even delivering more. So there's getting across that point. And of course, training managers in how to incorporate flexible working into their teams. Now, luckily, there's lots of good support material. The Chartered Institute of Personal Development and Chartered Management Institute, for example, provide some great material on that. And it'll help you, for example, adapt your performance management process to support flexibility. It'll help you think through the high quality IT infrastructure that you need, and also establish structure and protocols for team communications. But I think what it will be important going forward is everyone's included potentially in this. So part-timers, contractors, potentially also included too. And then just this ongoing communication of why flexible working is so important, and promoting success stories, showing that it can work. And I think those are all key things that are going to help you establish flexible working successfully. And as we said earlier, we really are going to need that in the new environment. The second point I mentioned was about mental health, and here we were very lucky in the last IPS webinar by Susie Shaw of Citrine Wellness to go through some of the major things that companies can be doing around mental health. And I don't want to repeat those here. You can get a link to the webinar and hear what Susie was saying. But I just wanted to stress the importance of this. And actually, a very big gap that, for example, the CMI showed was that actually when they did their survey, really half of managers have never received any training on mental health in the workplace. And actually, in the year before they did this survey, 30% of managers had been trained. So a whole 70% had not had more recent training on mental health in the workplace. So given that this is actually an important part of the risk assessment, the government's risk assessment, that you have this in place, I think it's critical for management to promote mental health awareness and offer support. And one of the things we discussed on the webinar that we had on mental health was around the importance of training and resources, for example, setting up a network of mental health first aiders. So there's a lot of work that organisations can do to try and support employees in the workplace. But it's clear that I think a lot of effort needs to be put in to bringing leaders up to speed on how they can have some of these conversations, because obviously, some of them are very personal. Employees are dealing with issues at home as well as issues at work. They may be carers. They might have issues with their childcare, for example. So how is all of that playing into their mental health, and how are managers dealing with that in a personal way and an empathetic way? These are sort of critical issues, really, to make sure that mental health is adequately addressed. Now, I want to get on to leadership, but I wanted to ask, firstly, what do these leaders have in common? Just have a look at the group here. You'll see the Prime Ministers of Taiwan, New Zealand, Germany, Denmark and Finland. And these countries all seem to have coped reasonably well with coronavirus and the epidemic. And there's been quite a lot of interest in, so why is it that women business leaders and women political leaders have been able to pull that off? It's not to say that some male leaders haven't, but it was really noticeable that, for example, for the work that Jacinda Ardern's done in New Zealand, just how she's gone about it. And just looking across how these women have led in this time, it's very much a combination of displaying, decisiveness and firm action, but empathy and good communication skills too. And I remember a lovely video that Jacinda Ardern did in her sweatshirt, sitting on a sofa, addressing the New Zealand nation. And you sort of think, wow, that's a way to put yourself on the same level as everybody else. We're all in this together, we're all in lockdown. How do we deal with it? So there's been quite a lot of comment really about the empathy and the emotional intelligence issues. There's a couple of articles in Forbes magazine which are interesting on this, and Stephanie Jennings, one of the journalists for Forbes, was writing about how it takes a unique sort of confidence to lead in this manner, where you have leadership that's vulnerable and assertive, but empathetic and tough. So I think there's a lot that we can all learn from those kind of competencies. I think men can display these too, of course, but it is a question of the leadership competencies that we require for the future. Certainly looking a bit different. And so when I was thinking through, okay, so what do we want leaders to do going forward? I thought there were four kind of key areas where leaders really need to be thinking. Firstly, it's around priorities, basically, and putting employees first. There's no doubt that in the past, companies have been talking about shareholders. Obviously, shareholders came first and customers came first. But as Bruce Carnegie Brown, who's the president of CMI, said, really now it's time that employees came to top of the list. So how are your people? How are they performing? Because if your people aren't performing, they can't serve your customers, and that's not going to help your business. So I think leadership is all about your people and putting your people first and linking with them. And that's where the building empathy, the emotional intelligence, the mental health awareness comes in that I was referring to. How leaders can build that and explore that within themselves to really open up, to have those conversations with their teams to try and make sure that all these issues are dealt with. And of course, it's very important. We've seen successful leaders communicate regularly, clearly and transparently about the business, and the future. So we've seen, for example, CEO of Marriott being very open in the broadcast that he's done around, how the business is struggling, what it needs to do in order to come back, and what he needs from everybody right now. So this honest and open transparency in communication is absolutely critical. And then, of course, leaders do need to connect. They need to connect with their teams on well-being and performance and on development, and they need to connect, and be authentic in that connection and really sort of show, if you like, themselves as well as leaders. So I think there are important developments, if you like, that we need to see amongst leaders if we're going to make all of this work. So pulling all this together, I've put together a checklist for returning to the workplace. And I won't go through all of this now. Not surprisingly, obviously, there's a significant element around employee safety and well-being, but also about culture change, really, about how do organizations move to, and the importance of moving to a culture which is more agile, for example, lean and digital, acceptance that remote working is here to stay, and this broader acceptance of agile working, and the need to continue to develop people, this growth mindset culture, for example, how the culture can shift in that direction. And then also the working practices, obviously, are around flexible working, but as we come back into the office, what's the right balance of commute to the office and work from home? Do you have team A and team B in rotation? How do you deal with contractors in the talent exchange pool? And then obviously, how do you manage performance? Do you need to review compensation and benefits to make sure that they continue to be fit for purpose? And then the whole home working environment, how that's working, and then guidance to employees on commuting and potentially, if there is any, business travel as well. For leadership, I mentioned the importance of having people-centered leadership, really with more emphasis now on emotional intelligence and empathy. So really a chance to explore that for leaders more, and mental health training very much needed, as I mentioned earlier. And then in all of this, we need to continue, and the government pointed this out in its guidelines as well, to make sure that the workforce reflects appropriate diversity and that we have inclusion in terms of how we're bringing everybody into this, so that people are really able to give of their very best, because it's that diverse workforce that's going to generate the new ideas and help drive the innovation that companies are going to need to have for the future. And then obviously there's the cost. You know, for example, looking at the cost, does a reduced office footprint mean that you can use money, for example, on increased remote working costs, or how do you balance that out? Are there innovative ways of sharing office space and office costs, for example, that you could look at? So as I say, there's a whole list of things here that you could be thinking about on returning to the workplace, in addition to all the safety issues. So what I wanted to do now was really kind of wrap this up, and I really wanted to end, I think, on an optimistic note, because we've heard a lot of challenges and a lot of issues around the lockdown, coronavirus, and obviously it's still an incredibly serious situation we're all in. Lockdown still, there's still a real risk that many of us can get infected, and that with serious health implications. So we certainly cannot underplay that. And what we are, I think, is also seeing is that coronavirus has changed our world. It's changed it in the short term, and I think it's going to change it increasingly for the longer term as well. There's definitely more focus now on health and well-being, and making sure that we're all staying safe. So we've made those adjustments in the short term. We need to now think about what the long term looks like. Companies, as I said, need to be more agile in order and innovative in order to embrace that. We see the move to online and automation, so that there's sustainability for the future. And of course, employee expectations are changing. What they're saying is, well, we're working from home now, it's working fine, why do we need to change? So I think there are big opportunities here for companies that can embrace these challenges. If their leaders can be leading with emotional intelligence as well as intellectual capabilities, but putting people first and communicating effectively is so important here. And really helping employees develop their skill sets for the changing world. And I think if we can all embrace this opportunity, I think the crisis represents a really good chance for us and our people to really show our potential to help build a better world. So I'd like to pass back to Tim there to see how the questions are coming in. Hopefully that's been a useful run through of some of the key issues that organisations need to address. So Tim, over to you for questions.
Rob, that has been brilliant. Thank you very, very much. Really enjoyed that. I've got a couple of questions I'm going to start off with, but this really is the opportunity for everybody to throw their questions into the mix. Please do add some via the chat box. I'll start with mine, but then we'll look to it as well. We'll throw others in as we go. Rob, my main question is on the training of new people into roles. If I look at the insurance industry, that you can train a lot of people in the technicalities of underwriting a risk, on what's a good risk, what's not a good risk. But a junior underwriter would learn a lot being sat next to an experienced underwriter in the Lloyd's building when a broker has come to see them and has broke their risk, and that junior will see how the experienced person is dealing with the way the broker's trying to sell, with what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. I can see that being more difficult to replicate in an environment where people are working from home a lot, but equally that might just be a very old school attitude that we need to move on from. So any perspectives on how we develop the newer people into roles, whether that's underwriters, brokers, HR, claims, recruitment, anything, I think that would be really valuable.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tim. And obviously that is a very real challenge, because the old model was to sit side by side and learn from each other, during these kind of events. And of course, in the new environment, there may be possible to have some of that with some sort of social distancing. It'll be very interesting to see how that might work. But I think increasingly what we're going to be seeing is that we will be doing quite a lot of this remotely, and we will need leaders and experienced workers to really connect online with people that need to learn, and the new people coming through, and they need to spend time with them, and maybe that's on a one-to-one basis, talking through how they're planning to run the meeting, issues that might crop up during the meeting, and then obviously a debrief afterwards as well. So I think there are ways of kind of getting around this. It's probably not as good as learning from seeing and doing right in the moment, but I think in terms of preparing and then kind of running the event and then doing a debrief afterwards, I think that's probably going to be the way that we can manage it online for the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a question here. To what extent do we think that managers are going to have to learn to trust their teams to work from home?
Yeah, I think basically trust, as I mentioned earlier, is a major issue here. There needs to be trust, if you like, or a culture of trust. So in other words, the organisation needs to trust the employees, the leaders need to trust their employees. But obviously, there are mechanisms for checking in with employees, making sure they're getting on with what they're doing. There will be performance goals, there'll be performance targets, there'll be jobs that need to be done. You can see where the progress is being made. So I think there are definitely tools, management tools, that can support that. So I'm not saying let's have naive trust in employees just to kind of, I'm sure they're out there somewhere delivering what they're supposed to be delivering. What I'm saying is basically that organisations do need to trust that employees are embracing this in the right way. But I think that regular check-ins and these tools around performance management and checking through the work lists and checking through progress on projects, how that's all going. And these regular check-ins, I think, will help you assess pretty quickly if things are going right or if things aren't going in the right direction at all. And in that case, obviously, you can set up sessions with the employees to talk through, okay, so this isn't happening as we expect, so how can we deal with it? How can we amend the situation and behaviours, perhaps? So I think there will be opportunities to do that, but I think we've got to start from a place where we're trusting people, and then really kind of move to support that with kind of management techniques to make sure that that is all delivering as well.
Perfect. Okay, I've got another great one here. If somebody's looking at a new employer, what signs should we be looking out for? What questions should we ask to make sure that employer is taking the change seriously and managing the new normal well?
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, firstly, I guess if you're looking at a company as a potential new employee, one of the things you want to do is look at their website and look at what they're saying about how they're dealing with this particular crisis, and how they're dealing with the safety assessment and how they're dealing with the risks that represent. I think the kind of questions have definitely got to be around, well, how are you supporting your staff and how are you supporting your leaders to help staff through this through this crisis, and obviously, how are you enabling your employees to learn on the job, to develop? I mean, those questions I think will still be there too, but I think employees will be trying to assess, or new employees will be trying to assess, what's the remote working technology? How will I be able to work remotely? How is this all going to work? And will I need to spend some time in the office? It's really trying to understand that whole landscape, but it's understanding the support. It's understanding the way in which the employer would need them to work. It's understanding the culture that they're going into, and of course the steps that have been taken to ensure that if they have got to go into the workplace, that there's physical safety.
Should companies provide masks if we want, or should an employer provide a mask if we want our staff to use public transport to get to work?
Well, obviously, I think each employer will take a view on this, but I personally, I think it would make sense for employers to be able to do that. I mean, one of the questions, of course, is sourcing. So where are people going to get masks from? We've been able to buy some, for example, from local pharmacies, but there's going to be an increasing demand for that. I would say that from a good employer point of view, it would make sense to find a way to enable your employees to access masks. I mean, it may well also be that masks might be made available at certain transport points in the future. They've certainly done that in other countries. But I would say whatever employers can do to enable their employees to feel safe on the journey into work and also being in the workplace, they should be doing. And of course, there will be questions about, do we wear masks in the workplace when we're actually in the office? And, again, those will need to be addressed. And if employees feel that they need masks to be comfortable doing their work, then again, I think it would make sense for good employers to provide those masks.
Rob, this next one is possibly one for the both of us to answer, but I'll ask you first. Which professional services sectors are recruiting or in the progress of recruiting, or might well be recruiting in the aftermath of COVID-19?
Right. OK, that's an interesting one. Obviously, there's a shock for everybody right now, and I'm sure many organisations have placed a temporary stop on new recruiting, and they'll be thinking quite seriously about how they need to reshape their workforce. But I think there are certain sectors that still will probably need to we're going to need in the professional services arena. Certainly, one can imagine that lawyers, accountants are still going to need to be able to provide the service they provide, even if, for example, they are trying to automate more. I think those professional service type firms will be ones that are going to be showing growth, and I think ultimately consulting firms will come back in the future and show growth as well. I think in the short term, again, that's a challenge, but I think as we increasingly come out of this, we'll see that there will be more demand to understand how to run businesses better, and I think consulting will come back too. But Tim, I'd imagine you want to speak about the insurance sector as well.
Yeah, but from a personal point of view, my thought, or probably hope, is that we've gone through that point where firms were sort of battening down on recruitment. Everything was going on hold. If we look at the end of March, we went for 1 week where firms are saying it's business as usual. The next week, a huge number of recruitment processes were all put on hold, and that was all in the hope that at some point, a month or two later, we'd all be back working in London, or we'd all be back working in offices, and we could start interviewing people face to face again. I think with what the government announced on the weekend, with what Rob's talking about here, and the other stuff coming out in the media, that I sense that we're beginning to move to a new reality where we're not all going to be back in the office all together at the same time. Candidates probably won't want to come and do a face-to-face interview, or even be that confident that we'll be starting working in the office. So I sense that a lot of sectors will begin to move into well, actually, we're in a new normal now. We need to move on with these critical hires. So rather than just put it on hold, we'll begin to move out of that. If we look at insurance, well, there's going to be a lot of claims activity. So I think we can expect to be demanding claims, but it's difficult to predict exactly where that demand will be. But maybe over the next week or the next month, we'll begin to see a lot more, see a lot more happening there. But that's certainly my perspective. I've got another good question here, which I'm just going to ask here. Do we think that the size or the nature of offices will change forever after lockdown, or do you think it will we slowly move back to offices as we have in recent past?
Yeah, that's a great question again. I think there's certainly been a number of executives talking about how we won't go back to the situation we had before. That the concept of putting 7,000 people in a building, for example, is a concept of the past. So I think we are still going to have offices, but those offices probably are going to be smaller, spaced out, more, etc. I would think that that's what people are looking to. To try and spread the risk, I suppose. How do you manage, in a massive office block, trying to get 7,000 people into the workplace in the morning in the lifts, for example? I know that going to some big blocks in Canary Wharf, for example, just how impossible that will be to get all those employees into work in the elevators that exist. So, how do we keep people safe is the first question. But then, as we embrace this working from home thing as well, will we need to have as many people in the office? So I think there will be a rethink of what we need the office for, who needs to go into the office to do that kind of work, and then how we do the rest remotely, and basically, frankly, from anywhere, probably. And so I think there will be an impact. I think we will find that employers will be looking for probably less space or space configured differently than it was previously. So the big office blocks of the past, I think probably, there's some kind of challenge to seeing how they're going to work in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got another question from me. Your slide on the modernising rapidly, I absolutely agree with that. And I think if I look around a lot of insurance and financial services and probably the legal profession as well, I think it's fair to say we're all paid the salaries we are because our ability to engage with a multiple range of stakeholders, to influence, to provide solutions, to ask questions, and to be absolutely engaging with people. And the roles in the last few years that we've seen that don't do that, the ones that firms have looked to outsource or to move to other and probably more cost-effective locations. In this world of remote working, of a different way of working, we've got to find a different way of influencing and engaging, because frankly, it won't be done in a coffee shop or a face-to-face meeting in the same way. Do you have any perspective from either your Mercer time or others on how we can best be doing the influencing, the engaging, the stakeholder management?
Yeah, well, I think inevitably we've all had to transition a lot of that onto Zoom or Microsoft Team calls or whatever. And I know, for example, that I've been having lots of conversations with people, investing a lot of time in that to stay connected with them. And of course, one's had to do that remotely because that's just the situation that we're in right now. So I think we've got to put the time and the effort into continuing to talk to people, to get a sense of how our clients' needs are changing, and to get a sense of how our business needs to respond to that. And our networks need to be maintained. And I've been using LinkedIn quite a bit as well. There's some phenomenal articles that are on LinkedIn, and you can access those and share those. But I think what I've also found is just one-to-one Zoom calls or one-to-one phone calls can really help keep that network going. But you've got to put the time and the effort into it. So I think it's quite easy sometimes to sort of sit in your home office and just get on with emails and not think about, okay, well, do I need to actually speak to anybody today? Well, actually, I think it is really valuable to spend time. So think of a few people, I think, and maybe there's a couple of people a day you reach out to on your network just to check in with them, or of course your clients, and checking in with them about what's going on for them and how they're doing. And I think that's the way to really get a sense of how you need to adjust, how the organisation needs to adjust to deal with this. And I think we will find that organisations are moving quite quickly here. So staying in close touch will be really important because it helps you keep your finger on the pulse.
Absolutely, thank you. Thinking about recruitment of leaders and how they lead during this time, what do you think are the key points to watch out for on CVs? I hope that's one for you rather than me, because I don't have an answer.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, CVs are a starting point to assess, what a leader's experience is, and you'd be looking for leaders, with experience of working in a way that has, empowered their staff and where they've communicated well with staff. And that's kind of hard sometimes to really assess from the CV unless the leaders have put that in. So, for example, if I was a leader right now writing my CV, what I'd be putting in at the top is really all the bit about how I've managed in an agile environment, how I've communicated, how I've showed empathy, how I've worked with my team, etc. Because I think those are the kind of qualities that we're going to need to see in leaders, as well as obviously the business results that have been achieved. So yes, of course, we need leaders that are really good with people, but we also need leaders that know how to get results as well. So, and it's that combination, as I mentioned earlier, with the women political leaders, of the empathy and the emotional intelligence, but also with that decisiveness and an ability to take firm action. So, you're looking for people that have worked in an environment where they've had the opportunity to do that. But of course, the CV will only show part of that. And it's up to the leaders to put themselves forward in their best light on their CV. Obviously, the key opportunity to really assess their capability for a role is to really, have that one-to-one discussion with them. And I think even remotely, that can still be done.
Yeah, perfect. We've got another question here. if we won't have massive central offices for big companies in the future, is it possible that we may go back to having smaller local hubs, either sort of a hub or a branch network, in the way we might have done in the past?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Back to the future, or whatever. I think certainly there is an increasing interest in working and living kind of, in a community, remotely, etc. And so one can see the attraction of having local offices that mean that the commute, for example, can be done safely. So, for example, at Mercer, we had offices in all sorts of different towns around the M25, for example. Employees loved that because they could just get in their car and drive from their home to their local office. And while we did have a central London office, and we still do, the local office actually was very, very popular because it was close to home. It meant a shorter commute. And of course, in this new environment, it means a safer commute potentially as well, because you're not having to get on public transport. And, I think that's one of the issues that's still very real for anyone coming into central London, is how they're going to address that whole getting into work question. So I think, yes, there will be, an increased emphasis on those, those hubs, those local hubs. I think those will support what people want to do, how they want to live their lives. And what we're already seeing actually is some conversations that are happening around whether people want to live in cities in quite the same way anymore anyway, that they want to move out and they want to live in more spread out communities. I think people have realized that when you live all together very, very closely with situations like a coronavirus, the spread, as we've seen in central London, for example, is rapid, and it's difficult to control. So people are already asking the question about, well, should we change our lifestyle? Should we think about moving out of the city? And then obviously the attraction of having a remote hub to work in is absolutely there, and it's even greater.
Absolutely. Thank you. Do we see a complete recalibration of benchmarking on salaries and skills requirements, knowing that the premium London waiting salary might now drift away? Therefore, will we see a different dynamic on where we recruit resource from and the skill sets?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, we're already, pre the crisis, sort of seeing some of that, really, organizations thinking, hang on a minute, why are we employing staff in expensive locations at expensive, for example, kind of London waitings? Could we move some of that work to areas where it costs less to live, and therefore we don't need to maybe pay those kind of London waitings, as it were? And obviously you can look further outside the UK to say, well, okay, is some of that work we can outsource to other countries? So I think there will be some rethinking of what needs to be done where, and and that will enable that conversation around should we still pay a premium for either people moving in or going to central London, or working in central London, or living in central London? Because I think we'll find, as I mentioned earlier, if people do want to move out of cities and move to locations that are more sort of remote or less well populated, and then we're going to find potentially there's an opportunity to recalibrate those, and I think that's one of the things that we need to look at. What's the impact on compensation and benefits as a result of all of this?
Absolutely. And one final question that actually came from an earlier one. Are there any best practice examples you've got on people using managing a team remotely or managing individuals remotely? Yeah, I mean, certainly I wouldn't necessarily want to name names, but I know, for example, when I'm working at Mercer, we placed a lot of emphasis on, and we were an international team, so we were working across international borders, but we placed a lot of emphasis on regular catch-ups at the same time. So basically we could share what was going on, and also kind of share challenges that we had. And I think the sort of best practice that I saw coming from that were very much around making sure that the agenda that we were going to talk about was interesting to everybody, that that there was something relevant to everybody, so that they wanted to be on the call. I think one of the real challenges has been in the past that we end up
with just the same old agenda, and it gets a bit dry after a while. So that constant refreshing of are we talking about something interesting? Do people want to be engaging and communicating? That's a very important thing. And then I think really how the leader of the call really runs the call to make sure that people are brought in. I mean, Tim, you and I had a discussion a while ago about introvert and extrovert, and how on, for example, Zoom calls, you bring in people that maybe aren't necessarily saying things that they want to contribute. So again, a good leader, of a call like that finds a way to do that and make sure that everybody feels included. So I think it's having a certain structure to it, a regularity. It's having an interesting content. It's making sure that everyone's engaging with it, and obviously making sure that there's follow-up from it, so that people feel anything that was discussed, actions need to be taken, were actually addressed.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we're out of the questions now. I'll do a general roundup whilst we're all on the call for the next few minutes. But if you've got any more questions, please do throw them in there, and we'll slot them in quickly. I just want to say a big thank you to Rob for what has been a brilliant session, a really great range of perspectives, and also thanks to everybody for any of the questions that have come through, and for all of you for staying on this session. We're IPS and Alec & Seal. We want to be active partners with everybody, and certainly all of you, on how we move out of this lockdown over the next few months, and probably longer than that. If there are any other topics that come to people's mind, any other concerns, issues that we'd like to be engaging with on a future event, we want to carry actively partnering with Rob, with Susie Shaw from the previous session. I don't think we can all sit here with the answers, but actually engage conversations on how we can move forward. So certainly that's something that we want to be part of. So please do put those through, either to the IPS or Alec & Seal consultant that you spoke to about this event, or through to me, through to the IPS general email address, or anything on the chat box here. But I do confidently feel we can all move forward successfully, whether we're recruitment firms, insurance firms, law firms, a wide range of businesses, if we're engaging and providing solutions to each other, and that's what we want to be part of. And if we can provide a unique perspective, we'd like to do that. So please do ask the questions and keep everything coming. But yeah, a big thank you to Rob. Have a lovely day, everybody. Have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll have a unique perspective to talk to you about soon. Thank you very much.